But to kind of bring folks up to speed on what this issue is before we jump into it, as I stated at the top of the show, House Bill 1775, popularly known as the critical race theory bill, even though the state board and others go to great efforts to say that that's not actually what they're banning. They're banning all this other stuff. But anyway, it's a kind of a vague law that sounds great when you read it, but in practice, it's really hard to figure out what it's going to do. But it bans teaching divisive concepts. I'm pulling up the language here on the screen for folks if you're looking at it. It bans mandatory trainings, which felt pretty targeted at OU given their many instances of massive racism that they've had to deal with in recent years. And yeah, I don't know. Representative Nichols, do you want to, maybe go into a little bit more about what the law does or claims to?
You know, you said when you first read it, it doesn't sound so bad. I remember the first time I read it, I thought it sounded pretty bad.
Yeah.
And the goal of the legislation, if you were to talk to the author of the legislation, is to, ban teaching that one race is superior to the other. I have not seen a curriculum anywhere in my entire life where it said that one race was superior to another, right? So that doesn't happen.
Right.
The goal of the piece of legislation, and this is admitted by them, is essentially to make it so white people don't feel guilty for slavery and for all these other things in the past. And I've talked to a lot of white people. Nick, I don't know if you feel particularly guilty for slavery. I'm here to tell you as a black man, you shouldn't. But what I think the goal is not just to protect white fragility, because that's what that is all about. But the goal, on the other hand, is to say, hey, we're at an inflection point. Think about what we found out in 2020. We found out that in the course of a pandemic, it impacted people of color more. We found out, here's this racial awakening after George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota. And so what started to happen was this whole idea, this responsibility we all have to begin to build a more equitable society. 1775 and those pieces of legislation is to throw cold water on those efforts, right? So that we stop learning about how we got here. And if we are not learning about how we got here, then we don't really have an obligation to change things, right? Everything is just fine as it is. And I know we're going to get into some of the stuff that Texas is doing. And I can tell you right now, I would guess what Texas is doing around taking the I Have a Dream speech and Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez, all those people out of curriculum, out of history books. That's going to show up it's going to cross the Red River, I bet, right? Because really the goal of this is not necessarily because kids are being taught that a race is superior to another, but it's because young people and really all people across this country are starting to understand that the foundations of how we got here, the reasons why health outcomes, the reasons why the criminal justice system is like it's the reason why black wealth is 10% of white wealth is because we have systems that were put in place that made it so. And that's really what all this is all about.
That is the answer to the first question. So why is this discussion happening now? Ari, do you have thoughts on the timing of these sorts of efforts?
So I definitely do think it has something to do with the 1619 project. I do find it extremely ironic that that project is led by a Black woman. Along with critical race theory, a lot of it was popularized by white philosophers and just critical thinkers. I think it's pretty telling, the fact that Trump specifically targeted the 1619 project and anything critical race theory related or any diversity initiatives. And all of them happen to be led by Black women. I think the timing of it is because they see the power in Black women in our minds and just the critical theories that we have beyond just the critical race theory, and they see that as a threat. That's my personal view of it. I think the timing of it is very coincidental.
Yeah, no,
or not.
Yeah. No, and that was definitely the thrust of the proponents, I guess, of the rules at the State Board of Ed. I mean, it was, and some of these folks I've met in real life, weirdly enough, it was powerful white women who like don't want to feel bad about how history happened. And so, that like that was their really their only argument. I mean, they didn't really frame it any other way or try to make it about, again, when I said the law sounds good when you read it, it's like, well, we don't want to teach that one group is superior to another and stuff like that. They didn't frame it like that at all. They were straight up like, I don't want to feel bad for like things that happened. And so, yeah, I mean, so as we kind of go through this, I mean, what are the concerns that you all have? I mean, I'm seeing it already firsthand, but what are the real concerns here about how this plays out in institutions of learning and in classrooms around our country?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing is that in this entire conversation, and I remember we were having this debate on the House floor. I believe, and you can go back and check, I asked how many people of color had anybody talked to. Frankly, give me an example of where this is a problem in the state, like all these things, and it was none on the people of color, and it was some kind of random sort of stories that folks had kind of gotten, right. So not a specific example of this being an issue. And so anytime that there's not been somebody, a student, for example, who's articulated this as an issue, or a group of students who have articulated this as an issue, and we're moving legislation forward, it has to be for some other reason. And for me, and the reason why this is so important is, like I said before, we're at a real inflection point in this country. We have to decide, are we going to keep going down the same road that we've been down that's led us to, by any standard, by any measurable data-driven standard, incredibly unequal and inequitable society. And so the only thing that we can do, the question is, can we fix the system, or do we have to completely change the system and overhaul the system? And what power does when that question comes up is power says the status quo must remain. And so what we are seeing now is the status quo, the push from power to say the status quo is going to continue to remain, which, for me, and I'm thinking about how this plays out for everybody in this country. For me, it means that the richest country in the world is going to accept the fact that people of color will never have the outcomes of white people, right? So to me, it's almost like you are reaffirming segregation. You're reaffirming, at least maybe not segregation itself, but the outcomes of segregation, right? So like what happened because of segregation. So you're reaffirming those things, and you're starting with education. And if you think about every big movement, it starts with educating or indoctrinating people to believe a certain thing, certain truths. We know we have our history books are already whitewashed. I don't even know what we would call this now, right? This is beyond whitewashing history. And Nick, and Ariana, all about this last year. We had the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It took like 70 years for the city of Tulsa to even recognize that it happened and apologize for it. It took another 100 years for us to really, begin to show the rest of the world and the rest of the country what happened there in Tulsa. Imagine all those other stories that already are not told in history books. So we're going from we already didn't talk about those type of things to now let's not talk about Martin Luther King. Like what? Like it's like the one black guy everybody knows in history, yeah. Right? Let's take that out of there too. And so this is really about, and the reason why it's so concerning. This is power, particularly white power in this case, saying that we don't want to feel guilty, which I don't think anybody should, but we are waving the white flag on our obligation to do anything about it, and we're going to make sure that not only we're not going to do anything about it, but who they really don't want to feel guilty is that we don't want to feel guilty for not doing anything about it. That's what's really at play right now.
Yeah, and I mean my experience in education, because I'm not from Oklahoma, I've lived here 17 years, but I moved around a lot and experienced lots of different styles of education system, is I've learned, and I think a lot of folks feel this way. I mean, like you mentioned about the Tulsa Race Massacre, is I've learned really crazy stuff already in history that isn't accurate or good, and then realize later. I remember some nursery rhyme type song about how great Christopher Columbus was, you know, only to find out later that it's like, you know, he committed like atrocities and,
Yeah.
you know, really wasn't a great human all around. I mean, he did do some exploring, but there was a lot that went with that. Uh, and you, I mean, you go down the line. I mean, you just think about all the things that people are taught or not taught, you know, that is exempted from being learned about. And then you realize later, holy cow.
We definitely weren't learning about young Native children being buried at boarding school. Like we didn't learn about that. Now we're starting to. So like
We
all this.
were, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
We were reenacting the land run
Right.
up until last year. And some schools still do.
Right. I remember before they changed the name at Lee Elementary School in Tulsa, they had a birthday party for Robert E. Lee every year at the school. And this is like up until like maybe 2 years ago. They were having birthday parties for Robert E. Lee. And it's just like, whoa, what? What are we doing?
So,
Probably, by the way, probably
Yeah,
never set foot in Oklahoma, I would imagine.
say that again.
Like, I said Robert E. Lee, who probably never stepped foot in
Yeah.
Oklahoma, like no connection to Oklahoma. But for some reason, you know, we have been taught to think that this is like this great military leader that we should be celebrating. And I'm like, well, kind of a traitor, I think. But those aren't the things that, you know, we're taught. And again, you know, if we think about the impact of the 1775, it is that, right? It is that, you know, it's this complete whitewashing and then erasing, frankly, of history. And then the critical part of it, right, is that, hey, because all these things happen, Nick, don't feel guilty about them, but you need to understand the context in which we operate in this country today and what that means we have to do today, because intentional things were done to hold certain people down. So the intentionality on the other side has to be the same.
I know. And when you think about like what we learn in school, and not to dwell on this topic too much, but like, you know, a lot of people's understandings of race relations in this country end at like To Kill a Mockingbird, and like, you know, things that are like really not great stories to begin with, but then like just limit your thinking. It's like we enforced housing discrimination in this country until the 1960s, and arguably still do it today in pockets where people just haven't been caught yet and haven't, you know, been stopped. And so, and you like, when you start to like look at the, and like you mentioned, the 1/10 of, you know, black folks have 1/10 the wealth of white, like that, there's reasons for that. Like there are structural economic reasons that we did that we should probably either undo, stop doing, make reparations for. I mean, you know, like there's just a lot of learning that needs to happen, and passing laws like this seem to do the opposite.
I definitely agree. As like a recent product of like the Middle School District, I had a current HBCU student. I'm learning more about Oklahoma history at my HBCU all the way across the country. I never learned about Claire Looper. I never learned about the cat sit-in. I didn't learn my states or my state capitals, but that's something in of itself. I didn't learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre until my freshman year of college. Like I missed out on a lot, and it's beyond just like what you're taught in your home, because my mom didn't learn about that either. My grandma might have, but we're not taught about it in school. I'm pretty sure for the Middle School District, they just started requiring it in the curriculum last year, shortly after the George Floyd protests. But it took that long just to learn about the Tulsa Race Massacre for it to be a requirement, which is absurd.
You know, Nick, you talked about, which that is crazy, first of all. Like, you know, I mean, the fact that every Oklahoma particularly in like the Oklahoma City area, didn't know about Clara Looper, is just like blows my mind, right? Like blows my mind. It's I almost had to take a deep breath after you said that. You know, Nick, you talked about the long-term issues in housing discrimination up until the 1960s. My grandfather passed away in November at 81 years old. And my family, we're from Texas, and he was born in South Texas. He was born a little over 70 years after slaves in Galveston were told they were free, 2 years after they were supposed to be free. So like, you know, he was 81. So in the, you know, in that span of time that had happened before he was born, and both my parents were born before they had fair housing laws, before they were guaranteed the right to vote. before there was the equal rights legislation in the 60s. I am at 37 years old, I'm the first generation in that line of my family to have every right that we're supposed to have on the books. And I was born in 1983. So like that is that's what we have to talk about, right? We have to talk about why that trajectory is different, and not that, oh, that was a long time ago. It wasn't that long ago. These things happened in the lifetime of my great grandparents, my grandfather, and my parents. My mom, who is not even 60 years old yet, right? Who's living, breathing, running around, more active than I am. In her lifetime, she was born in a country where she did not have federal protections on housing, federal protections on voting, federal protections as it related to equal rights.